My daughter asked me to co-sign her apartment lease. When I said I wanted to see the lease first, she said I didn't trust her. I have co-signed exactly one thing in my life before this: a car loan for my late husband Greg back when we were newlyweds and he had no credit history to speak of. I understood then, the way I understand now, that co-signing is not a gesture of love. It is a legal commitment to pay someone else's debt if they cannot, and it shows up on your own credit regardless of what happens between you and that person afterward. When my daughter Emily called me in March asking me to co-sign her first apartment lease, I said yes before I'd even seen the building. When I asked 2 days later to actually see the lease itself before signing anything, she told me I didn't trust her. I want to walk you through what happened after that, because I don't think wanting to read a legal document before putting my name on it should have turned into a referendum on whether I believe in my own daughter. My name is Carol, and I'm 58 years old, and I want to start by saying that Emily is 24, smart, hardworking, and the kind of daughter most parents would consider themselves lucky to have raised. She graduated from James Madison 3 years ago with a degree in marketing, has held the same job at a regional advertising firm in Richmond since graduating, and has never once given me a reason to doubt her judgment about most things in her life. I want that established clearly before I tell you the rest of this, because I think there's a version of this story where it sounds like I'm describing some irresponsible kid I had reason to be suspicious of. That was never the situation. This is a story about a basic financial precaution that somehow got reframed as a referendum on our relationship. Emily had been living with 2 roommates in a townhouse for the past 2 years, a perfectly fine arrangement that had simply run its course. One roommate was moving for a job, the other was moving in with her boyfriend, and Emily reasonably decided it was time to get her own place. She found a 1-bedroom apartment in a newer complex closer to her office, toured it, loved it, and called me the same evening, practically bouncing with excitement. "Mom, I found the perfect place," she said. "It's got a balcony. It's 12 minutes from work instead of 35. And the leasing office said I just need a co-signer since this would be my first lease without roommates and my income alone is right at the cutoff for what they require." "That makes sense," I said. And I meant it. First-time solo renters get asked for this all the time. It's a standard practice, and I had no hesitation about the basic idea of helping her. "Of course I'll help you with that, sweetheart. Send me the details whenever you have them. They need it signed by Friday," she said. "Can I just tell them you're in? They'll email the lease directly to you to sign electronically." "Sure," I said. "Just send it over once it comes through and I'll take care of it." I want to be honest that in that moment, I was not thinking carefully. I was thinking about my daughter's excitement, about a balcony and a shorter commute, about being the kind of mother who says yes when her kid needs help. The actual mechanics of what I was agreeing to hadn't fully formed yet in my mind as something separate from the emotional moment of the phone call. It was 2 days later, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee and the start of what should have been an ordinary Wednesday, that I actually thought through what I'd agreed to with any real clarity. I am by profession a bookkeeper. I have spent 26 years managing accounts for small businesses around Henrico County, reading contracts, flagging discrepancies, understanding exactly what fine print can do to people who don't read it. It is frankly embarrassing to me now that I went 2 full days without that part of my brain engaging on my own daughter's lease, the same way it would have engaged immediately for a client. I texted Emily that morning, "Hey honey, before I sign anything, can you send me the actual lease document? I want to read through it first. Just standard practice before signing any legal contract." I did not think there was anything remotely unusual about this request. I have read every contract I have ever signed, including ones for things far less significant than agreeing to be legally responsible for another adult's rent for a full year. This is simply how I operate, and how I had assumed Emily understood I operate, given that she'd grown up watching me do exactly this with every contract that crossed our kitchen table over the years. Her response came about 20 minutes later, and it was not what I expected. "Why? You said you'd sign it." "I already told the leasing office you were good to go." "I am good to go," I texted back. "I just want to see what I'm actually signing before I sign it." "That's normal, Em. I do this with every contract." There was a longer pause this time before her response. "It kind of feels like you don't trust me, Mom, like you think I'm lying about something in it." I sat at my kitchen table and read that text 3 times, trying to understand how we had gotten from a reasonable request to read a legal document to an accusation about trust in the span of 4 text messages. I called her instead of continuing over text, because some conversations don't translate well into typed words, and I could feel this one sliding toward a misunderstanding that would only get worse if we kept going back and forth without actually hearing each other's tone. "Em, I need you to understand something," I said when she picked up. "This has nothing to do with whether I trust you. I would ask to see this exact lease if you were my client at work tomorrow morning. I asked to see every contract before I put my name on it. That's not about you specifically, that's about how contracts work. But it feels different when it's your own daughter asking. she said, and I could hear something in her voice that was somewhere between hurt and defensive. It feels like you think I'd somehow trick you, or that I don't know what I'm signing myself. I don't think that at all, I said. I think you're a smart 24-year-old who's never signed a lease without roommates before, and I think it's reasonable for both of us to read it carefully, because there could be things in there neither of us has thought about. Early termination fees, what happens if the cosigner wants off the lease after a certain point, renewal terms, things like that. This is just due diligence, Em. It's not personal. It feels personal, she said. It feels like you're treating this like a business deal instead of like helping your daughter. I sat with that for a moment because I understood, even as I disagreed with the conclusion, where the feeling was coming from. To a 24-year-old signing her first solo lease, excited about a balcony and a shorter commute, the idea of her own mother wanting to read the fine print before agreeing to be financially responsible probably did feel like a strange kind of withholding, even though from where I was sitting, it was simply the ordinary practice of an adult who reads what she signs. I am helping you, I said. I said yes. I'm not backing out of helping you. I'm asking to see the document before I sign it, which is a completely separate thing from whether I'm willing to help. Can you just sign it though, please? They need it by Friday, and I don't want to lose the apartment over this. I did not sign it that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the moment where this could have gone differently if I'd simply caved to avoid the discomfort of her being upset with me. Send me the lease, I said. I will read it tonight, and if there's nothing concerning in it, which I expect there won't be, I will sign it tomorrow morning, well before your Friday deadline. That's not me dragging this out. That's me doing exactly what I said I'd do, just in the right order. She was quiet for a moment. Fine, she said, in a tone that made it clear this was not actually fine. I'll send it tonight. She hung up before I could say anything else, and I sat at my kitchen table feeling a specific kind of unsettled that I hadn't expected to feel over something as straightforward as wanting to read a document before signing it. I had said yes to helping her. I had never once threatened to withdraw that. And somehow in the space of one phone call, I had become, in my daughter's eyes, a mother who didn't trust her own child. I want to tell you exactly what I found, because I think the specifics matter here more than the general feeling of unease I had reading it. Most co-signer clauses I'd encountered over the years, both professionally and in the one car loan I'd signed for Greg decades earlier, work roughly the same way. The cosigner is liable for the lease term, typically 12 months, and that liability generally ends when the lease ends, assuming no renewal. What I found on page 3 of Emily's lease was a clause stating that the cosigner's liability automatically extended to any lease renewal unless the cosigner submitted written notice of intent to withdraw at least 60 days before the renewal date, every single year, indefinitely, until either the tenant qualified to remove the cosigner through an income verification process or the tenant moved out entirely. In plain terms, if Emily renewed her lease next year and I didn't catch the 60-day window and submit paperwork to withdraw, I would automatically remain financially liable for a second year, and a third if the same thing happened again. There was no automatic expiration. The burden was entirely on the cosigner to actively opt out year after year or remain on the hook indefinitely. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Then I called my friend Diane, who's a paralegal at a firm downtown, and who I'd called for a second opinion more than once over the years on contract language that seemed unusual. That's not illegal, Diane said, after I read her the clause over the phone, but it's definitely not standard, and it's not something most people would think to ask about, because most leases just end when they end. This one's structured to make the cosigner responsible for actively remembering to get off the hook every year, which is a pretty different thing than what most people assume they're agreeing to. So if I'd just signed it without reading it, I said, you'd have been on the hook indefinitely unless you remembered, every single year, to submit paperwork 60 days ahead of a renewal date you might not even be tracking, Diane said. Honestly, Carol, this is exactly why you read things. I called Emily the next morning, not to say I told you so, which genuinely was not the impulse I was working from, but because I needed her to understand what was actually in the document before either of us went any further. I found something in the lease I need to talk through with you, I said. Is something wrong with it? Her voice had an edge of worry now, different from the defensiveness of 2 days earlier. I explained the clause carefully, the way I'd have explained it to a client, walking through exactly what it meant in practical terms, that this wasn't a simple 12-month commitment. It was a commitment that would silently continue unless someone actively interrupted it every year. There was a long pause on the line. I didn't know that was in there, she said quietly. I read through it pretty fast, honestly. I was excited about the apartment, and I just kind of skimmed the financial stuff because it all sounded standard. That's exactly why I wanted to read it before signing, I said, as gently as I could manage. Not because I thought you were hiding something or because I don't trust you, because this is a 14-page legal document and most people, including smart 24-year-olds excited about a balcony, don't catch every clause on a fast read. That's not a flaw in you, Em. That's just what reading contracts quickly does to anyone. I'm sorry I said you didn't trust me, she said, and her voice had lost the edge it had 2 days before. I think I was just so excited and stressed about the deadline that it felt like you were the obstacle, instead of realizing you were actually trying to protect both of us. I understand why it felt that way, I said. I think when someone you love asks to slow down and read something carefully, especially when there's a deadline pressing on you, it can feel like resistance instead of care. But I wasn't trying to slow down helping you. I was trying to make sure the help I gave you was actually safe for both of us. We talked through the practical next steps together. I suggested she call the leasing office and ask whether they'd be willing to amend that specific clause to a standard term limited liability, or whether they'd consider an alternative, perhaps requiring the co-signer for the first year only, with Emily's own income reassessed for renewal, which is actually a fairly common alternative many property management companies will agree to once asked directly, since the unusual clause likely existed simply because it was their boilerplate and most co-signers, understandably, never push back on it. Emily called the leasing office that afternoon. I want to tell you that the conversation went perfectly, and they immediately agreed to change the terms, because that would make for a cleaner story, but that isn't quite what happened. The leasing agent initially told her the lease terms were standard and non-negotiable. Emily, to her credit, didn't simply accept that. She asked to speak with the property manager directly, explained the specific concern about the indefinite renewal clause, and asked whether they'd be willing to amend it to a term limited to the initial 12-month lease, with a fresh cosigner review required at any renewal instead of an automatic continuation. The property manager, after what Emily described as a slightly awkward pause, agreed to amend the clause. I suspect, though I can't prove it, that this wasn't actually a clause they enforced strictly in practice, but rather one buried in their boilerplate that most signers never questioned, and that asking directly and specifically was simply enough to get it adjusted. They said they could change it, Emily told me that evening, sounding both relieved and slightly surprised. I think nobody ever actually asks about that part. That happens more than you'd think, I said. A lot of contract language just sits there because nobody pushes back on it, not because it's actually fixed in stone. I signed the amended lease 2 days later, well within the original Friday deadline, after reading through the revised version carefully one more time to make sure the change had actually been made correctly and nothing else had shifted in the process. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for understanding the rest of this story. Even after the clause was fixed, even after Emily apologized for the trust comment, there was still a slight residue of tension between us for a week or two afterward. Not anger exactly, but a kind of careful politeness that wasn't quite our normal rhythm with each other. I think we were both turning the conversation over privately, trying to understand what it meant about how we communicate with each other, beyond just the specific lease itself. I called my sister Donna, different Donna than the one in some other family story, just a coincidence of common names. Mine has been my closest confidant for decades, and told her the whole thing. She accused you of not trusting her for wanting to read a legal document, Donna said, and then it turned out there actually was something concerning in it. I know, I said, and I don't want to make this into some victory lap moment where I get to say I was right all along. I think what actually bothers me more is how quickly "I want to read this before I sign it" turned into "you don't trust me." Like there was no room in her mind for those to be two separate things. Do you think that's about you or about something more general? Donna asked. I thought about that for a while. I said slowly, that Emily's generation grew up hearing a lot about boundaries and trust as concepts, which is good mostly. But I wonder if somewhere in that, the idea of someone wanting due diligence got tangled up with the idea of someone being suspicious of you. Like those are supposed to be the same thing. And I don't think they are. I think you can love someone completely and still want to read what you're signing. I made Emily's favorite meal that Wednesday, chicken parmesan, the recipe she'd been requesting since she was about 12 years old. The kind of thing that felt slightly absurd to be making for a 24-year-old adult who had just signed her own apartment lease. But some habits between a mother and daughter don't change just because the daughter has a balcony now. She arrived a little early, which she rarely does, and helped me finish setting the table without being asked, which she also rarely does. I noticed both things and said nothing, because I've learned over the years that Emily talks more easily when she isn't being directly asked to talk. We ate for a while, talking about ordinary things, her new neighbors, a work project she was excited about, whether the balcony got enough sun for the herbs she wanted to grow. It wasn't until we were clearing the plates that she actually brought it up. I keep thinking about that text, she said. rinsing a plate at the sink while I dried. The one where I said it felt like you didn't trust me. I think I owe you a better explanation than I gave you at the time. I'm listening, I said. I think part of it, she said slowly, is that this was the first really adult thing I've done completely on my own. No roommates splitting the responsibility, no built-in safety net, and I think some part of me wanted you to just say yes immediately and completely, without any conditions, because I wanted to feel like I'd actually pulled off something grown up by myself. When you asked to see the lease first, it felt like you were treating it like it wasn't really my accomplishment yet.
Like it still needed your approval before it counted. I set down the dish towel and looked at her.
That's helpful to understand, I said. I don't think I saw it that way at all in the moment. I was thinking purely about the practical side of it, that I was about to be legally responsible for a contract, and any responsible adult reads a contract before signing it, full stop. I wasn't thinking about it as me approving or not approving your accomplishment, but I can see now why it might have felt that way to you. And then it turned out there actually was a problem in there, she said, half laughing, half wincing, which I guess proves your point more than I wanted it to. I don't think of it as proving a point, I said. I think of it as that clause existed whether I caught it or not. If I'd just signed without reading because I didn't want you to feel like I was questioning you, you'd have ended up potentially liable for renewal terms you didn't understand, with me on the hook right alongside you. Catching that wasn't about being right. It was about both of us actually understanding what we were agreeing to. I think the thing I'm still working through, Emily said, sitting back down at the table, is figuring out where the line is. Like, I don't want to be the kind of person who gets defensive every time someone wants to double check something I've done, but I also don't want every interaction with you to feel like I'm being evaluated. Does that make sense? It does, I said, and I think that's a fair thing to want to figure out. I'll be honest with you. I think some of this is generational, in a way that isn't really anyone's fault. When I was your age, nobody talked much about boundaries or trust as concepts the way your generation does, which has real value. But I wonder if somewhere in learning that language, it got tangled up with the idea that any request for information or any moment of caution is automatically a violation of trust, instead of just being a separate, practical thing. Wanting to read a contract isn't an emotional statement about whether I believe in you. It's just what reading a contract is. I think I get that now, she said. I think in the moment it just landed as criticism instead of care, because I was stressed about the deadline and excited about the apartment, and any friction felt like an obstacle instead of a safeguard. I understand that, I said. And for what it's worth, I should have explained myself a little better in that first text too. I just said I wanted to read it, without explaining why that mattered to me, or that it had nothing to do with doubting you specifically. I think if I'd led with that explanation instead of just the request, it might have landed differently. We sat with that for a while, the kitchen quiet except for the ordinary sounds of dishes settling and the refrigerator humming. Can I ask you something? Emily said. Honestly? Of course. Are you glad you asked to see it? Even with how it went, with the tension and everything? I thought about that question seriously before answering because I wanted to give her something true rather than something easy. Yes, I said. Not because I enjoyed the disagreement, and not because I want to be right in some permanent way that I bring up later. I'm glad because that clause was real, regardless of how anyone felt about my asking to see it. If I'd skipped reading it to avoid an uncomfortable conversation, the actual legal reality of what we'd both signed wouldn't have changed. It would have just meant we found out about it later, possibly at renewal time, possibly after it was harder to fix. I'd rather have an uncomfortable conversation now than a real problem later. Emily nodded slowly. I think I needed to hear that put that plainly, she said. Not as a lecture, just as the actual reasoning. It's not a lecture, I said. It's just how I think about most things, honestly. I read contracts. I ask questions. It's not about you specifically. And I'm sorry if it took us a few days to get to a place where that was clear between us. I'm sorry I made it about trust when it wasn't, she said. I think I'll try to remember the difference next time, between someone wanting to check something and someone doubting me. I want to tell you that everything between us has been perfectly smooth since that dinner, but I think the more honest version is that we're simply better at naming things now when they come up, rather than letting a misunderstanding sit unaddressed. A few weeks after she moved in, Emily called me about a separate matter. A friend had asked her to co-sign a phone contract, and Emily, almost laughing at herself, said, I told her I wanted to see the actual terms first before I agreed to anything. She seemed kind of surprised I'd ask that. Good, I said. That's exactly the right instinct. I think I get it now, she said. It's not about not trusting someone. It's about understanding what you're actually agreeing to, regardless of who's asking. I think that's the part of this I'm most glad about, more than the lease clause itself, more than being proven right about wanting to read it. Emily didn't just patch over a moment of friction with me. She actually absorbed something from it that she carried forward into her own decisions, separate from our relationship entirely. The apartment, for what it's worth, has worked out well. The balcony does get enough sun for her herbs, mostly basil and a stubborn rosemary plant that seems to be thriving despite her self-described lack of a green thumb. She had me over for dinner there last month, made something complicated with that basil, and we sat on the balcony afterward with tea, watching the evening settle over a parking lot that somehow still felt like a nice view, because it was hers, and because she'd gotten there by reading the fine print instead of around it.